Does AI, that's associated with contracting, um, interface with modeling? Like, here's our contract. If it's implemented, here's what the cash flow is going to look like, or here's the risks, and here's the likelihood of this. I mean, does it help with that side of the equation?
Absolutely. So we actually have a feature called Deep Insights, which is where, I've got 20,000 documents in my repository. We've done 20,000 deals, let's say. Okay, but that is dead data unless I can understand what's in it at scale. And it kind of draws from our history in due diligence, which is you've got a large amount of data. How do I distill that into a useful understanding? And then layer on top of that, how do I build a future-facing strategy? Now, if I can look at how many of my contracts have 2 years or more left to run, how many of them have invoices that I've paid, how many of them have unusually questionable termination rights where our customer could exit, and how much can we rely on that? That kind of stuff already exists, right? So that's not a future-facing development question. I'm sure the capability and variability of what those tools look like for different organizations will increase, but that's already there. It's already being used, including internally by Luminance. Our COO will use tools like that all the time to understand what our positions are for preparing for board meetings and investor decks.
Yeah, it's super interesting. You mentioned at the very beginning it might be characterized as the jurisdictional issues. Obviously, legal systems are different place to place, and if you're building a global company, that's an obstacle to scaling. How are you dealing with that?
So it's more of a complicated issue in research, because you can ask an AI system a generic high-level research question, and it may give you a very compelling common sense answer, but there may be a jurisdictional nuance which is completely missed. That is definitely higher risk and something that can be resolved through all kinds of mechanisms, whether that's better data or better prompting. From a contracting perspective, the main thing is that you empower the organization to set their own parameters. So what really, let me distill the training down, what we're really talking about when we talk about contractual positions is if you've got 200 million document data set, that's been the core training set of a company like Luminance, how do you, one, identify what is generically standard? Like what is typical? To quote lawyers, what's market? Every conversation about what's market. And then the second thing is, are there nuances when you refine that data down to a jurisdictional basis? Now, maybe you've got enough data on a particular jurisdiction, maybe you don't. And I think transparency and signposting when you don't is really the key, because if I'm telling you that a particular liability position is generally correct, but you are operating in Azerbaijan, which might have a very specific position, I need to be honest, I probably don't have as much data from Azerbaijan as I do from the US. And signposting that is key. Now, those problems will become smaller and smaller as clients leverage their own data sets, because really we're not providing legal advice. We're allowing them to leverage, hey, they might have 10,000 Azerbaijani contracts, or they might have 10,000 US contracts. And maybe irrespective of what the jurisdictional requirements are, their company position is they always do this in their contracts, and that's what they want automated into their negotiation processes.
The final question, we're in the very early days of some of these technologies. You guys are the oldest AI company around. You've been doing this for 10 years, but I'm being facetious, but you've been around a while. But one of the lagging indicators of a moment like this is government and how government responds to it in a regulatory way. And so one of the issues we encounter a lot is government people don't really understand what's going on, and they've got various special interest groups whispering in their ear saying, "Oh no, don't let them do this, and block this, and require lawyers to do this, and say you need human eyes to sign off on that," and so forth. And I'm just wondering, as a last question, what are the kind of regulatory issues that are on your horizon that you're coping with now?
The greatest issue is fragmentation, right? The US, the EU, China, Japan, all these different territories have wildly different approaches to AI regulation. Some of that is to do with cultural nuances, some of that is to do with internal political alliances, some of that is to do with special interest groups and commercial drivers. But I think it would be unfair to say all politicians involved in AI regulation don't know what they're doing. I think there's plenty who are perfectly capable. Last time I was out in San Francisco, I met with some very capable political figures discussing exactly this kind of thing, trying to offer an international experience outside of the Californian or US ecosystem as an offer. Now, the problem
Although, by the way, the flip side of that is that increasingly the fragmentation you talk about is not nation to nation, but national to subnational. And here in the United States, when the federal government leans back on regulation, California steps up and says, okay, we're going to set our own rules. And even at the city level. So, it's a lot like the very early days of trade policy where you've got hundreds of regulatory codes to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. The issue there is if you are trying to build your internal your own governance for what you're going to do, what products are acceptable, what you can and can't do. But second of all, your own strategy for product development, for buying things in, for where you're going to open offices, all of that kind of stuff gets impacted by this. The regulatory discussion is best served through exactly that. Good discussion between territories. And at the moment, there's a lot of siloed conversations. Maybe the US is having a conversation over here with the UK one day. The next day, the UK is having a conversation with Saudi Arabia another. The greater alignment. There have been global AI conferences where political leaders have made commitments, but those have often been about signposting spend. We're going to build more data centers or whatever it might be, rather than we're going to do a trade deal, which means that we're going to align on regulation. So a great example is, GDPR, which is, for those who don't know, the European data protection regulations. When the UK left the European Union, one of the more sensible things, in my view, that happened was the UK had a choice of completely going its own route or visibly aligning to the European Union, subject to future changes. Now, the reason it was sensible to align was because it gave commercial certainty. Great, if we're a UK company and we're going to sell into the European Union, we're not going to have different rules one way or another. And then if the rules change as we go along, we can adapt to that, but we have visibility of it. Nothing changes suddenly in a way that could be damaging to us. And I think
staying in the European Union would have achieved that as well. But we can keep,
Yes. I don't know how politically neutral I'm supposed to be on these things, but I'm half European, so my Belgian mother would definitely agree with you. But the reality is we landed in that position. Voters made choices, and regulators are faced with decisions every day, which are the fallout of voter decisions and voter tendencies, even just like what voters are vocalizing, because it's actually normally the vocal minority who has the greatest impact, right? Because they're the ones showing up to the voting booth. They're the ones who are writing the most angry letters to their political leader. They're the ones who are fundraising to do whatever it may be. Now, the UK has been closer to the US than to the EU in the case of AI regulation, i.e. quite low regulation so far, quote unquote pro-innovation approach. But I do think we will move towards a more legislative driven regulatory approach. And I actually am, this is just my personal view, I'm sure this is not Luminance's necessarily, but my personal view is that a federal AI regulation is likely to be a good thing for businesses, at least, because it will allow certainty and clarity. And actually, I think it will probably benefit consumers as well, because one of the things that is unfair to a consumer in Colorado or Texas is that maybe a person in California is actually getting a better deal or a worse deal, it can go the other way, than they are, simply by virtue of where they live, even though they're in the same country. And I think that's slightly questionable, and it goes into state and federal politics. But for AI regulation, we can learn from data privacy as well in the US, where there is still a patchwork and it is an operational nightmare for everyone involved.
Well, as somebody who, for a chunk of my career, was a senior trade official negotiating trade deals for the U.S., the arguments sound very similar. That if you can get to federal level or international level agreements, you provide greater transparency, greater predictability, scalability, and lower costs because of the efficiencies that are associated with it, at least theoretically. But that's a subject for another conversation.